we're live. I can see the needles bouncing. So, as I said when the recorder is off, I'll start by saying that today is October 28th, and I'm interviewing Dr. Fred Fiedler, currently Professor Emeritus of Psychology, University of Washington, at the annual meeting of the International Leadership Association in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Fiedler has been honored by the International Leadership Association with a Legacy Award for Lifetime Achievement in the study and practice of leadership. So I'd like to ask your permission to record this interview, to have the interview transcribed, and to deposit the recording and the transcription in the IUPUI archives for the use of their patrons.
All right.
Thank you. Okay. So as I said, we'll start with simple, basic questions.
Let me ask you something.
Yes.
Will I see the completed interview?
You bet. We can give you a copy if you'd like.
And I can make changes if necessary.
Our policy is to do a verbatim transcript, but if you want to make some corrections, that would be fine. If you want to add very much, we'll ask you to add it at the end.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So I read that you were born in Vienna, Austria, July 13, 1922.
Yes.
Who were your parents?
The names?
Yes.
Victor Fiedler and Hilda Fiedler, Hilda Schallinger Fiedler.
And what did your father do?
He had a tailoring supply shop, often company in Vienna. It was and he manufactured sugar sacks.
Oh.
In addition,
Uh-huh.
it was a moderately successful concern, but not great.
Would you say that you had a comfortable childhood?
Yes.
What did your mother do?
Well, she, after I was, I think, about 10 years old, she worked in my father's business, selling and keeping books.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
No.
Only child?
Only child.
Okay. If I did the math right, you were just short of your 16th birthday when Hitler's forces invaded Austria.
You got it correct.
What was it like for you growing up as a young Jewish boy in Austria at that time?
It was okay until I got into grammar school, into elementary school. And then I was the only Jewish child in the class, and Austria being Austria, I got hazed and occasionally beaten up. And I had a very, very poor grade. I think I was the only child in that school who ever flunked freehand drawing.
I shouldn't laugh, but my handwriting is so awful that I could flunk it myself. So, so you're.
But on the other hand, I then went I passed the examination for the Realgymnasium, which is the higher academic high school.
Right.
And I was a very poor student. As a matter of fact, I failed in 3 different subjects in the 3rd grade, and was kicked out of school. And I then went to a private school for the 3rd grade, and after that, my parents gave up. And I was apprenticed to my father's business very reluctantly. And then in 1938, as you pointed out, I came to the United States by myself.
You were not interested in going into your father's business?
No. I don't know. I certainly was eager.
Why do you think you were such a bad student?
I think it was because my grammar school experience was so bad. I hated school. And in high school, it was certainly better. I was not officially hazed and beaten, but high school was, there were a lot of fights there, and I was one of them. And when I repeated the course, repeated the class, in my third grade, I was both older. I was the youngest child in my grammar school and the high school. I was older, and I completed the third grade, not brilliantly, but passably. And then I was taken out of school.
So basically, while you lived in Austria, you completed 3 grades of elementary school.
No, 4 grades of elementary school.
4 grades, okay.
And 3 grades of high school.
So basically, you, as if I counted up right, at the age of 15, you became a high school dropout. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
early, perhaps somewhat earlier than 15, but I didn't. It wasn't more than a year and a half, I'm sure.
I read something that you wrote as I was doing the background for this interview, and you described the Austria that you grew up in as alive with ideas.
Oh yes.
And you were quite a young boy then, so were you cognizant of?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I read a lot, and met some people, but I was intellectually interested, which is why I passed into the Realgymnasium rather than the lower vocational school.
Who did you meet?
I don't think anybody whose name would stand out. But my father was intellectually alive, and so was my mother, and they read a lot. And there were interesting discussions.
I also read that you decided at the age of 12 that you wanted to become a psychologist.
Yes.
How does a 12-year-old boy make a decision like that?
Well, I read a lot of psychology. And as a matter of fact, when I was a child, I wanted to become a detective or an explorer. And I ended up very close to that.
That's right. A researcher does both, doesn't he?
That's right.
Yes. Did your parents or your teachers ever look at you and go, why is this young man failing his courses and he reads psychology at such a young age?
Yeah, there was some interest. But I don't think I was ever thought to be a particularly brilliant child. I was certainly interested in a lot of things and interested in ideas at that time and the discussions about ideas.
Anything in particular that you remember from those discussions?
No, not that I can recall.
So what did a young boy do besides read psychology and go to school?
Well, I read a lot of detective stories and romances, and not romances as much as history. Detective stories, the sort of thing kids read at that age. And I really knew a lot. For instance, I remember now that I knew every capital of every European city, of every European country, and I knew a lot about the countries. And, I certainly knew a lot more than most kids my age did.
Well, that's kind of what I was driving at. Did your parents ever realize what a smart child they had?
Yeah, but they also realized what a stupid child they had.
March 15th, 1938, Hitler's troops marched into Vienna, and according to what I've read, they were greeted by large cheering crowds of people who were happy to see them.
Oh, yes.
And things got pretty bad for Jewish people living in Austria. Do you remember anything about that?
Yes, some.
What?
But it wasn't as bad as it got to be later on. I remember that on my father's business was a big sign, handwritten, that this is a Jewish store. And there were a lot of marches by, and there was one case where I was very surprised to find that one of our best customers, associate, was a member of the party.
The Nazi Party.
Yeah, the Nazi Party.
Were you afraid?
Not really. Too much. Not. It was uncomfortable, but it wasn't frightening. On the other hand, I was very happy to get out.
Yeah. You left 3 months after the Nazi invasion for the United States because
Yes.
you found distant relatives in South Bend, Indiana?
Not in South Bend, in Chicago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I had relatives in South Bend too, but it was a big family who were quite active, and one of my distant cousins was a very prominent lawyer who arranged for the papers and so on.
So did they find you or did you find them?
Oh, I had written to a younger, distant cousin of my age, and I was sort of thinking of going before them. It was either, and my father had written to some associates in Australia, and I was thinking of emigrating, even when I was, I don't know, 14, 15. I guess I started corresponding with this kid my age when I was about 15 or 14 or 15, early enough. It was no surprise that I could get a visa early.
Do you think that your parents, or you for that matter, had any idea what was coming? Really? How bad things were going to get?
It was always, Vienna was known as a city with a lot of Jews and a lot of anti-Semitism. So it wasn't really surprising that I would write to my cousin and thinking about emigrating to Australia or to the United States.
So I read that you sailed on the SS Manhattan
Yes.
out of Hamburg, Germany.
Yes.
Did you have any trouble getting the paperwork?
No.
No.
Not at that time.
Did you travel alone from Vienna
Yes.
to Hamburg?
Yes.
What do you remember about that trip?
It was long, and I was not particularly anxious. I was met by the only incident that I can remember giving me any anxiety was when a couple picked me up from Hamburg,
Mm-hmm.
and drove me, they said, to the ship. And I couldn't quite figure out while we were driving why they would do that. And I asked them to stop and let me get out with my baggage. And they did,
Mm-hmm.
but surprised that I would do that. And the rest was easy.
Did the Nazis make any effort to hinder your departure?
No, not at that time.
How did you feel about going off on your own and leaving your parents?
It was an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
I was not. I was never that close to my parents that I would feel that this was a major tragedy in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Look forward, as I wrote in one of my later papers, that it was an exciting thing to go to the land of cowboys, Indians, and big skyscrapers.
Did you ever find any cowboys and Indians?
Not immediately.
No.
As a matter of fact, I was met by the big family which
Mhm.
had brought me over. They had, and then an elderly couple who had a big fruit business in South Bend, Indiana, became my hosts.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a son, an adopted son, who was about to go to Purdue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was the only, after the summer vacation was over, I was the only child in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And it was comfortable.
What do you remember about crossing the Atlantic?
I was in a cabin with three American fellows
Mhm.
who had who had been in Europe for vacation,
Mhm.
and was treated reasonably. I was treated well.
Mm-hmm.
I met one. I was in third class, and I met a kid who was going to Little Rock, Arkansas, with his family,
Mhm.
and we palled around.
Mm-hmm.
It was not unpleasant.
Did you have much of a command of English when you came across the ocean?
Some,
Mm-hmm.
but enough so that within the summer, I came on my birthday, and which was in July, and by the time school started, they had me enrolled me in the second grade of high school
Mm-hmm.
in South Bend. There were no difficulties.
So German was your first language?
Yes.
And did you speak Hebrew? No?
I was supposed to.
Well,
That's one. There was an obligatory religion class,
right.
and it was a pain in the back.
Uh-huh.
And there was some formulas I had to learn for my 13th birthday,
Mhm.
which is called a bar mitzvah.
Right.
And I knew enough to pass that. But I never spoke Hebrew. And my parents spoke Czech,
Mm-hmm.
and I never learned. And they talked Czech to each other, but not to me.
Mm-hmm.
I picked up enough English within 3 months to start getting along in high school.
Now, did you take any English classes when you lived in Vienna?
Yes, I took some English private instruction, and it was enough to get me started. So I could manage high school without too much trouble as soon as I started.
When the Manhattan got to the United States, where was your port of entry?
New York.
Yeah. And did anybody meet you there?
Yes. A relative I'd known about met me and showed me New York, and
You got to see the skyscrapers.
skies, indeed. Took me to see the Rockettes,
There's a treat.
which I didn't quite appreciate, and put me on a train to Chicago. And in Chicago, I was met.
So your family was in Chicago,
Yes.
right?
Well, they were in Chicago and other places, but Chicago was their headquarters.
And so how did you then end up with these people in South Bend? Were they related to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were part of the family.
Okay.
I stayed one night in Chicago, and then the next evening we drove to South Bend with me in a rumble seat.
It's almost like being a detective again, isn't it, in that rumble seat? What was the most surprising thing to you about the United States as a young boy getting off that boat?
The most surprising thing was that they put me into high school,
Yeah.
because I wasn't eager to go into school after my experience in Vienna. And they entered me in a second class, second
Right. So you
grade.
started off as a sophomore in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, I finished high school in 2 years.
So what was it? How did the experience in high school in South Bend compare with school in Vienna?
Oh, it was very pleasant. But there was some, I had to work hard, but I was certainly not mistreated. It was a pleasant surprise. There were girls there.
Skyscrapers and girls. I mean, that's
Next to Indians, best thing.
that's right. Now, your parents did not come to the United States with you. They went to
No.
Shanghai, right?
They went to Shanghai.
Why did they go to
Well,
Shanghai?
that was my cousin in Vienna went to all the consulates in the city to see if he could get visas. And he got visas from China, from a consul who broke the rules. It was later fired by the Chinese. It was my parents and their uncles and aunts in Vienna. Our family was very lucky. Got out.
Most of them got out?
Yeah. My grandparents did not, however. They were my mother's uncles were among the most wealthy people in Austria. If you ever been to Vienna,
I have not, no.
well, the two hotels, the best two hotels had been built and were managed by my uncle, or my great uncle. He also was part owner of a bank or something. I think I met him once in my life. It was not a close family. And for my birthday, for my 13th birthday, he gave me a 25 shilling gold piece, which must be worth all of $6, I think.
Mm-hmm. That was it.
That was it.
As you look back on growing up in Austria, how do you think that growing up there shaped your personality and your, maybe even your ultimate professional success? What do you think you took away from that in terms of your personality?
Well, I was the youngest of two other cousins, and we were very close to those two other cousins. And the fact that I was doing poorly in school was sort of a downer. But we had good summers.
Mm-hmm.
And we met very often over the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And played together, and afterwards went to movies together, stuff like that. It was not a bad childhood.
As you got older in the United States and began to go through graduate school and achieve some success, did you ever feel as though you kind of needed to make up for your school experience in Austria?
I think it certainly shaped me.
Yeah.
I was surprised. I must say, I'm still surprised. Because my other cousins did well, but nothing like this.
Mm-hmm.
One of them both went into business. My uncle, one of my uncles manufactured push carts, which sold hot dogs, and later went into more elaborate trucks, which sold and did well. And the other cousin said, and I think I have reason to believe him, that he was the cuckoo clock king of Canada. And then I have a girl cousin who was, I think, 2 or 3 years younger than I, who married a physician who lives, who has since died,
Mm-hmm.
and she lives in the Seattle suburbs, San Rafael, I think, or
Mm-hmm.
something.
Obviously, you became one of the leading scholars who studied leaders and leadership, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but do you think that Hitler was a leader?
Who?
Hitler?
Oh, yeah.
By your definition, would he be a leader?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No question about it.
Mm-hmm.
Not my type.
No,
Sure.
I didn't ask you to endorse him. I just. Why do you think that he would meet the definition of a leader?
Oh, he had a big following, enormous following. And Germany was ripe for it. They were suffering from the humiliation of the First World War. And they were out for blood. And Austria had a lot of cheering for him.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Austria. And perhaps more in Austria than in many parts of Germany.
Why do you think that was?
One thing was that there's always been a lot of Semitism in Europe, in many European countries, and among them Germany and Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jews were prominent in the arts, sciences. And I mean, Vienna was really the cultural capital of much of Europe. And a lot of the people in that area of writing and music and poetry and science were Jews.
Mm-hmm.
The Jews felt that my mother drummed into my little head that having a profession like that you can take with you.
Mm-hmm.
While many of the Germans many of the Austrians were lower class rather than middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were very prominent. As I said, one of my uncles was one of the most prominent men in Vienna, although we had nothing to do with them.
Did your parents eventually end up in the United States?
Yes.
Did-
After I think they were in China for 10 years and then were able to get a visa and lived in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
My father died within a few years afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect because he was a chain smoker.
Mm-hmm. Did your mother live long enough to witness your success?
Enough so that she knew that I was a faculty member at the University of Illinois.
Um,
And that I'd gotten a PhD. I don't know if you know. I got a PhD and my undergraduate and graduate degree and everything else in just 5 years,
right.
including a dissertation which became well known.
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but when I read that, I couldn't believe that you did all that stuff in 5 years.
I don't either. But of course, this was after the war, and I picked up some credits from Indiana, Turkish language,
Yeah.
Turkish area of language for 1 quarter, and then I got a few credits from just being in the Army and taking some courses there. But I entered Chicago I was a summer quarter at Western Michigan College in Kalamazoo, and didn't feel comfortable there. I thought that
Was it teachers'
easy.
college, wasn't it?
Huh?
Was it teachers' college then?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it didn't quite fit. I got into Chicago and was drafted within a couple of months. I met my wife there.
Yeah. I talked to some of your colleagues before I did this interview, and each one of them in one way or another said, ask him what he did between high school and college.
Aha.
And all I could find was that you claimed that you had 20 different jobs in a few years. What were you doing?
I don't think 20. I'm not sure about that. Well, I was a farrier's apprentice for a while. My uncle's friend was a prime farrier in South Bend, Indiana, and helped clean furs and well, that lasted for a while I was still in school. And after that, let's see, I was the assistant of the superintendent of a junkyard. And I was, for a few days, working as helper in a bottling plant. I was what the hell was I doing? I sold auto parts for a short time. I was a salesman in in South Bend's big department store. I don't know what the gold something or other.
Mm-hmm.
Probably something like Macy's or Nordstrom's for South Bend. And
You sold hot dogs.
pardon?
You sold hot dogs at Calvin. You sold hot dogs at Billy Rose's house.
Oh, yes. When I came to San Francisco, I sold, I think I sold hot dogs at Billy Rose's Aquacade.
So you went from South Bend to San Francisco
Yes.
and picked up a little money as a hot dog salesman.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then I had a job in San Francisco by one of the big furriers.
Mm-hmm.
It was the most miserable job I've ever had. I stretched mink skins. Have you ever seen a mink skin stretcher?
I've seen hide stretchers. I know what you're talking about, yes.
And that clock just did not move. It was a miserable job. I can't remember anything
It
else.
sounds like you were doing the kind of things that persuaded you that graduate school would have been a good idea.
Yeah, I had. I started having thoughts about college after I graduated from high school. I mean, I went through high school, through a 4-year high school in 2 years. And I came out in the upper third of the class.
When you were drafted, and you spent a little time studying Turkish, but you ended up in the civil affairs military government branch,
Yes.
assigned to Germany,
Yes.
to occupied Germany.
But before then, I was in a motorized medical battalion
And where were you stationed?
all over.
All over Europe?
No, this was in the United
Okay.
States. So I remember Tennessee maneuvers,
Mm-hmm.
and I was a clerk in headquarters. And then I was shifted to the. I was in the Austrian battalion too, and we complained so much that the Austrian battalion was discontinued, was broken up. And because I was one of the people who said that, I thought I didn't want to stay in the Austrian battalion. I got a low mark.
The Austrian battalion.
Yeah.
That was assigned to Austria?
No.
No.
No, it was here.
Oh.
It was in Camp Atterbury.
Oh.
I haven't thought about Camp Atterbury for some time.
That's in Indiana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I was, after Turkish area and language was discontinued because there wasn't going to be a fight with Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
It was an interesting assignment. I was classified as an interpreter, but I was really a headquarters clerk and had some fairly important jobs. There was one point where I did some political science, political intelligence work, and I was sent to Frankfurt to supervise moving the Social Security of Germany from one place to another. We were stationed in Marburg. And so that was just interesting assignment.
What kind of political intelligence were you?
Oh, talking to Germans about how they felt and stuff like that. Nothing new. I did interview Adenauer once.
Oh.
Or, if not, no, I don't think it was Adenauer. It was people who knew Adenauer, and I was doing some background checking.
Did you ever see any irony or justice in the fact that the Jewish boy who fled Hitler's army was back with the conquering army,
Well,
occupying Germany?
I wasn't the only one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Mm-hmm.
But we all did our job.
Were you a good soldier? Did you take to military life?
No, I think I was a good soldier.
Yeah.
Not an enthusiastic one, but a good one. I took my job seriously, and I got fairly responsible assignments. I had good relations with the officers. I mean, this was an outfit with 64 officers and 62 enlisted men.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the enlisted men were pretty high stuff. There was one who was a journalist, and one who was a lawyer there, and a social service, social work
Mm-hmm.
executive, and stuff like that. So it was a respectable outfit.
Did any of the experiences that you have in the military influence your thinking about leadership later on in your life?
Yeah, I suspect so. I took a correspondence course in industrial psychology. That was really my choice, industrial psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And was my choice until I got to the University of Chicago and into it.
Mm-hmm. And changed your mind?
It didn't change my mind. The Veterans Administration changed my mind.
Oh. Yeah, of course you had the GI Bill, right?
Yeah.
So you were discharged from the Army in November of 1945 and headed back to the University of Chicago. And I tried to add up the number of undergraduate credits you had, and I couldn't quite do it, but there were not very many.
No.
And yet you managed to test your way into a PhD program in one of the best universities in the country. I mean, you took some tests, and as I was able to, I think you started your PhD program in January of 1946.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, was that common for?
No.
No. How did you talk people into this? I mean, I'm wondering how this could have happened.
Well, as I said, I went to Western Michigan
Mm-hmm.
College, and I know that they thought that I was pretty hot stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They were impressed, and I also took some correspondence. I took some extra courses, which I guess they had never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
I was really interested, and I remember I wanted to take a course in Shakespeare, and here's the instructor, and thought that I would like to do a study of Hamlet or work with something else, and I said no, I'd rather have something I've never seen before. I did go to a lot of plays and operas in Vienna, and instead did my study of Troilus and Cressida, which I'd never heard of before, but he was very impressed.
Mm-hmm. I'm still trying to imagine how you knocked on somebody's door and said, I'd like to test into your PhD program.
Well, I don't know. I just I applied and was immediately accepted.
Oh.
Probably because there were not many males available at that time, but also perhaps because they were sort of impressed that I made it by myself, and did a good job at Western Michigan College.
Well, you married Judith Joseph, spring of 1946.
Denver.
Right. You know, that's often the question that either makes or breaks an interview. When I ask, usually a man with his wife in the room when he got married, and he can't remember. So I gave you the date. How did you meet?
We met at the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, she wasn't too anxious to meet me. And when, what was that date? Daisy May?
Oh, there was a, what was it called?
Little Abner's.
There were these parties that students used to have at the time. What were they called? A character from Little Abner who was desperately anxious to get married and whose father rounded up young men for her to look at. What were these? Oh,
Little Abner, the Little Abner cartoon.
you're too young for this. But there was a dance at which traditionally the girls asked boys. And Fred asked me to go to the dance with him. And I didn't really want to, but instead of saying that, I rather foolishly said, "Oh no, I'm supposed to ask you."
Oh. It's right on the tip of my tongue because people still use that term when I was in high school. I'll think of it in a minute. But so she went to the dance with you.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh yes. And then when I went into the army shortly, we got engaged. And while I was in the army, I came back and we broke up our engagement. And then decided to become engaged again. And then when I got back to Chicago, we married.
But we had met before this dance because we were taking the same class and got into an argument in class.
Uh-oh.
Something we really did.
So you were in class together, and you.
Yeah. An argument about
Herodotus.
Herodotus. That's right.
You know, I bet in all the stories a person could tell about how a man met his wife, there are not too many that could say it began with an argument over Herodotus.
Yeah.
While you were working on your PhD, which, according to my count, you got in just a little bit over 4 years, you also took a 2-year training program with the Veterans Administration on clinical psychology. Is that
Yes.
right? Why did you add that 2-year training program to your doctoral work?
Well, the Veterans Administration at that time was looking for clinical psychologists. And even if I told them that I was interested in industrial psychology, they said, that's fine. But they'll still pay tuition and the stipend if I switch to clinical psychology. And we had just gotten married, and the money looked good, so I did.
I also understand that you're involved in campus politics.
Oh yeah. I wrote the constitution of the government, of the student government organization, which was then being organized. But it didn't last long, and I wasn't. The guy who became president, I thought I should had something to do with the election too. Didn't choose me to be on the organizing committee. That ended my my student politics.
Did you think of yourself as a leader when you were in graduate school?
No.
I also understand that you were earning money working as a janitor.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
great books course. As a matter of fact, we did it together. Mortimer Adler's course. Judy, what did you do, Judy?
I was far above the level of janitor.
You were what?
I worked far above the janitor level.
She said she was far above the level of janitor.
Yes. Yes, it was definitely a down
But this was
come down for.
this was a university program for hiring students. So.
I see, like work study or something. You also underwent 2 years of psychoanalysis, which I assume is part of your doctoral training?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was that like?
Well, I saw the man once a week, and we talked. I didn't feel that this was. I didn't feel that was really exciting stuff, but actually, I talked a lot about my parents, and particularly my father, who was not the warmest and cuddliest kind. And after 2 years, we decided that that was enough.
Did you learn anything important about yourself while you were going through that process?
It's hard to say. I didn't have any great insights, but I thought it was reasonably helpful. That was a time when I was pretty anxious. Chicago was a tough school. Still is, I think.
I think it is, yes. Yes.
And it was perhaps helpful, I don't know. But besides being in clinical psychology, getting a psychoanalysis was sort of the thing to do if you could. And a lot of my classmates did.
You researched and wrote a dissertation that caught the attention of the field of clinical psychology. And I'm not a psychologist, so I'm going to quote you and then let you respond to this. But I read that little piece that you wrote in 1992 called Life in a Pretzel-Shaped Universe.
Yes.
And here's your assessment of your own dissertation. You said your dissertation shook up clinical psychology by focusing on the therapeutic relationship rather than the different techniques. And so I want to ask you a few questions about that. Keeping in mind that most of the people who listen to this or read the transcript will not be psychologists. So why did your dissertation shake up clinical psychology?
Let me first say it. Have you ever heard of a man named Stevenson?
I know.
Well, he is a statistician from England who developed the Q technique, which is a way of comparing what people said about themselves and said about others. And having had Carl Rogers was my sponsor for my master's thesis, which was my master's thesis was
Preventive psychology.
what?
Preventive psychotherapy.
Yeah. Whether preventive. Rogers developed non-directive therapy, and administered non-directive therapy to some students who were about to take the exams and some who were in the control group.
Mm-hmm.
That was published, and one of the few master's theses which got published at all. Most master's theses just
Stay on the shelf.
and some of them the waste paper basket.
So tell me what non-directive therapy is.
Well, it's mostly listening to the patient and and reflecting what the patient is thinking and feeling, and making clear to the patient how he feels and how he thinks. And it's fairly successful. It was very, very successful, in fact. Carl Rogers was the guru of psychotherapy, of psychological psychotherapy. Well, he was on my committee, and the chairman of the department, named Jim Miller, was my chairman at that time, and Stevenson was. So were two other prominent members. And Carl Rogers said, when I told him that I was going to compare, that I thought that different psychotherapists were really, that was really the relationship between the patient and the therapist that made a difference. And that different therapies would have similar relationships. Carl Rogers and the chairman of my committee said they wouldn't believe it even if it came out, and I shouldn't do that.
But you did it anyhow.
And I said, in that case, I'll do something else. And they said, no, can't do that. That wouldn't look good. So I did anyway. And I got 4 psychoanalysts and 4 non-directive therapists and 2 Jungian therapists, 2 of them experts and 2 non-experts. And I showed that that was indeed the case. And that was so against the common thinking in that era that it really shook people up. And it got published and republished. I became relatively well known in the area.
As you were working on this dissertation, you understood that you were breaking with established scholarship.
Oh yeah, I knew that.
How did a young,
It only
relatively...
took me 6 months to do it.
And how did a relatively young PhD student feel about what he was doing? I mean, you knew that you were going to publish a dissertation that was going to...
I don't know. I thought it was going to be a coup. And it was.
And that was your goal?
Well, I wanted to get a PhD.
Yeah.
I had while I was a student, a clinical trainee. I took a clinical internship. While I was a trainee, I published a number of papers, which was really unusual.
I mean, there are very few master's theses that get published, and very few dissertations that turn scholarship on its ear.
And I had a couple of things published, which were not dissertations or master's theses. I really had a knack for seeing problems which were worth examining. To give you an example, one of the fellow students, or fellow trainees, had gotten a bunch of drawings from patients. There was a test which was called draw man test or something like that. And I looked at them and said, you know, the patients which were successful didn't draw a face. And that was published. It was the student whose drawings they were and I published this together. And it was sort of an interesting thing.
And what was the significance of not drawing the face?
Well, that the sick patients, the sickies, didn't relate to people enough to draw their face.
Huh.
I mean, if you draw somebody's face, you've got to look at them.
Right.
And you've got to have some ideas about what kind of a person that is. Or at least that was the thinking.
And so someone else had the patients draw the pictures,
Yeah,
and you looked at them and reached these conclusions.
yeah, yeah. And then I had some other papers published. As I said, my master's thesis was published, and there were a number of others. I can't think of them now. They weren't terribly significant, but they were significant to be published in good journals.
One of the things that struck me when I read all the background material on you is that some people are fortunate if one time in their life they write something that catches the attention of their peers or has an impact on their field. But you not only caught the attention of your peers and had an impact on your field, but more than once you changed the orthodoxy. You know?
Yeah.
Why do you think that was? I mean, what do you think set you apart from your colleagues?
I had a knack for it.
Yeah.
I was a lousy therapist. I mean it. I was no therapist. But no holding of hands or curing schizophrenics or even neurotics. But I was a real hand at seeing problems.
I was going to say, the man who wrote the path-breaking paper on therapy declares himself to be not a very good therapist.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. Sure. I didn't think I was going to be a good therapist. As a matter of fact, the year I finished my dissertation. It was cited by Carl Rogers, who was then president of the Psychological Association, at the meeting of the Psychological Association. And my former supervisor thought that this was really unusual.
Were you there to hear that? Were you present when he did it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That was at the Psychological Association meeting.
That must have been pretty heady stuff for a young man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was.
You know, it just seems to me that as a young doctoral student, you began with your dissertation a pattern of breaking with established scholarship and blazing new trails, and that you just kept on doing that. Did you surrounded yourself with people who would go with you, and that you made a career out of
Yeah.
blazing
I think
new
so.
trails? At the point that your dissertation began to attract considerable attention from your peers, did you then begin to think of yourself as an emerging leader in your field?
No,
Still not?
I don't think so.
No. Okay.
I was a former graduate student.
Yeah.
That's not. But I was picked up after my dissertation. I was picked up by one of the real leaders in the field, a man named Kronbach.
Mm-hmm.
who was not only a statistician of first order, but he was an educational psychologist who was really leading the field. And he picked me up for 2 years, and for 2 years I worked with him, or under him, and they gave me a lot of leeway. And at that point, my first study after I got out of the PhD program was to study high school basketball teams. And I came up with a correlation of, I think, 78 or something. Nobody's ever heard of anything like this. And that was sort of a good thing to have on your record right then, there.
I read somewhere, actually I think I went and looked it up, that even into the 1990s, that your dissertation remained one of your most frequently cited works. Is that right?
It's possible.
Yeah.
I have not seen that, but it was quite a.
Well, you were still working on your dissertation, and then in the year afterwards, you worked with the Veterans Administration project, or on a project where you were predicting the competence of clinical psychologists.
Yes, that was while I was still a student.
And you developed criteria for assessing their performance.
I was hoping to do that. I don't think that was successful.
Well, you wrote at one point, you said that the research that you did there had a major influence on your professional life. And I'm wondering why it did.
Because on the basis of this research, which was really sort of a thing that didn't quite come the way they wanted it to come. And I never did predict the success of a therapist, as far as I know. But it led, when I went to the University of Illinois, I was interested in leadership, had always been. And it led to a measure called least preferred coworker.
Right.
And that was the measure which predicted, and a version of that measure predicted the success of basketball teams. That was sort of a good start.
I mean, I read that you also, in conjunction with that VA research, did some research with fraternity members.
With what?
Fraternity members?
Oh, yeah. Nothing great.
Okay.
It showed that fraternity members saw themselves, who liked each other, saw themselves as more similar than those they didn't like. And this came out of the therapy research.
And were both of those steps on the way to the least preferred coworker?
Yeah.
So as I looked back at the relatively short amount of time that you spent as a PhD student, and I don't mean this in any way to sound flip, but in slightly over 4 years you completed a master's degree, a PhD, you had your master's thesis published, you researched and wrote a path-breaking dissertation, you took a training course in the VA, you participated in student government, you worked as a janitor, you began a major research project with the VA. And I'm wondering, how did you do all this stuff and not get divorced? I mean, you must have been working all the time.
I was a workaholic.
Would you describe yourself as a workaholic?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But my wife was not too happy at that time. She was working too.
It wasn't a life that had much leisure in it.
Not much leisure. So, did you ever get a chance to enjoy Chicago while you were there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we lived in a community which, in a student housing
Mm-hmm.
project. So we had friends, and
Did you live right near the University of Chicago?
yeah.
You spent several months in the summer of 1951 at Randolph Air Force Base
Yeah,
near San Antonio, Texas, working with B-29 bomber crews.
yeah.
What were you doing down there that particularly related to your emerging studies on leadership?
Well, I studied bomber crews.
But what were you doing with the bomber crews?
Well, I gave them some of these tests, which I talked about,
Mhm.
some of which turned out to be useful and some of them didn't.
Mhm.
And as a matter of fact, as I went on with the analysis, it was quite clear that at least we felt Koberger scale, which we didn't call it that time, but it was related to the visual bombing performance of the aircraft.
Mhm.
One of the things that was unusual about my research is that I was always interested in hard criteria, in hard performance criteria.
And for the benefit of people who are going to read the transcript, what are hard performance criteria?
I'm sorry,
You said you were interested in hard performance criteria?
yeah,
Yeah, could you just briefly
like
explain
bomber
what?
crews.
Okay, I see. All right, okay.
Like, I wasn't interested in how they felt it. I was interested in how they felt about each other, but I was primarily interested in how their bomber crew performance record,
Okay, the results.
yeah,
Yeah,
the
okay,
results of visual simulated bombing runs.
Mhm. And what would you say is the significance of that research in terms of your developing understanding of leadership?
It was part of it. It was one of a long run of studies of this type. I think most close to 40 or more studies of leadership performance.
How did you get interested in leadership as opposed to all the other subjects you could have picked?
You know, I don't know, but it's been a long interest. And the fact of the matter is that my own leadership performance was very limited.
Your personal leadership performance?
Yeah.
So,
I was never a leader in high school or grammar school, nor in college to any extent.
so there's sort of a continuing pattern there. You wrote a path-breaking work on therapy and didn't consider yourself to be a very good therapist. You're one of the world's leading scholars on leadership and don't think of yourself as a leader.
That's probably true, although I did, of course, have some leadership responsibilities.
Certainly, yes.
And I ran 2 laboratories successfully. And for a while, I was head of a subdivision of the department in psychology in Illinois. But these were not.
I don't know. I think anybody who can lead academics deserves a gold star. But
Well, this was not a high-level leadership responsibility.
in the fall of 1951, you accepted a position as the research assistant professor of education at the University of Illinois, and your mentor was Lee Cronbach,
Yes,
and I'm going to spell that for the transcriber, Cronbach.
yes.
Why an assistant professor of education? I mean,
Well,
you
he
were a
was
rising star at that point. I assumed you could have picked your positions, but
I think he was interested in what I had done. And he was really not the typical education faculty member. He was a statistician of note, and had done some groundbreaking work in education. I don't know what I wouldn't. He was clearly one of the top people in this field. Became president of the American Psychological Association.
that must have been an interesting education department with the two of you in it.
Well,
Doesn't seem typical to the way I view missions of schools of education, but
we didn't have too much to do with
No.
education.
Mhm.
He had a laboratory. I don't know, I can't recall what happened, but he got a grant, which was then a big grant from the Office of Naval Research to study military psychology. And I guess I looked to him like a good bet. And I became the assistant. I was the assistant in his laboratory.
What was
top
a
assistant.
big grant in 1951?
Oh, $20,000.
My word.
It's a big
It
grant.
was. I mean, what could you do with $20,000 in
A lot.
1951? Yeah, paid your
His-
salary.
His research,
Mhm.
his salary at that time was $10,000.
Mhm.
And a research assistant, what, $2,500? $1,500? I don't know. I think a secretary got about. What do you think, Judy?
What? About-
What was the salary level at when I started out after my PhD?
I think it was 6,000 or 7,000.
How much?
6,000 or 7,000 for a graduate assistant.
6,000 or 7,000?
For a postdoc.
Something like that. It wasn't.
So $20,000 went a long way.
Yeah.
You know. And what was his ability to attract grant money from the Office of Naval Research related to the Cold War?
It was a big gun
Yeah.
in research.
And was that money available because of the U.S. involvement in the Cold War?
I doubt it. I doubt it. But I kind of think that he picked me because of my record. And there were a number of students working on that project, usually half-time.
Yeah. 1953, you moved to the psychology department
Yes,
and began the Group Effectiveness Research Laboratory.
yes.
Why the move to the psychology department?
Psychology department was a good department, and they offered me a job.
The Group Effectiveness Research Laboratory, though, is something that you began. So,
Yes.
did they offer you money to start up a lab, or?
I got a contract from the Office of Naval Research at that point.
So at that point, you had your own. You were
Yes.
the primary investigator on your own naval research grants.
Yes, yes.
Okay. And were you studying leadership at that point?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think the Office of Naval Research was funding studies of leadership? What do you think they wanted to get out
Oh,
of it?
they were, it was an important problem
Mhm.
for the military.
Mhm.
It didn't matter where the money
Mhm.
came from, but leadership was something they were really concerned about, and still are.
So the Group Effectiveness Research Laboratory, that was your idea as you made the move. Okay. What was its purpose? The Group Effectiveness.
Studied leadership.
Okay, and so you used it to attract graduate students, faculty, grant money.
Both.
Harry Triandis,
Yes.
TR.
He came
Yeah.
later.
Yeah. He was your student, right?
No, he was a faculty member.
Okay.
He had gotten a degree in engineering
Okay.
and switched to psychology.
Mhm. And he later joined you as associate director of the laboratory.
Yes.
What was his contribution? I mean, what did the assistant director do? That was.
Well, we had a whole bunch of different projects. Harry Triandis was interested in different cultures. And he worked with me on leadership projects. But he was a real hot shot.
Did his work on different cultures in any way influence your developing understanding of leadership?
Yes, and then we did a whole series of studies on intercultural communication and groups made up of different cultures. And yeah, I can't think right now of Harry's doing anything special to begin with. But he was a real hotshot. He later became a honorary doctorate from one of the Greek universities.
But that was when you did the culture assimilators.
What, Judy?
You did the culture assimilators.
Well, he was instrumental in that too.
The culture assimilators.
Yeah. Those are programs we developed for the military who were being assigned to other cultures. And we had it for Greece and for Iran and for India and for
Honduras.
Honduras, you said? Yeah.
Honduras.
Yeah.
Did a study in Honduras. It was an interesting project. But a side issue on the leadership problem.
You stayed at the University of Illinois and ran a group effectiveness research laboratory until you left for the University of Washington in 1969.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to note for the record here and then ask you some questions that 1967 you published a theory of leadership effectiveness,
Yes.
which was really a game changer.
And was published in 6 different languages.
When it came out in 6 different languages? Or
Right.
eventually translated?
I don't know how.
Okay.
It was. It's available in 6
Yeah.
different languages.
I found them on the internet.
Yeah. German.
Yeah.
German, Spanish, and Swedish, and Chinese, Japanese, and Thai.
I ran across a Chinese version when I was searching on you, but obviously I couldn't read it. No.
What's the matter with you?
I'm wondering though if we could start. If you could because your book was a game changer, could you start by explaining for people who are not in your field what the orthodoxy was in terms of leadership scholarship before your book came out?
Well, the orthodoxy was that they were looking for traits and attitudes and God knows what else of leaders. And those were correlated with leadership performance to a very low degree. And the way I changed that was to in two ways. First of all, I discovered, and other people also sort of were on that trail, that there were two types of leaders. Leaders who were task motivated, to whom the task was the thing, and the relationship was secondary. And leaders who were relationship motivated, that is, the important thing to them, aside from the task, was the relationship within the group and between the leader and the group. And in fact, people who are task motivated tend to think that they're relationship motivated. And people who are relationship motivated tend to think that they're task motivated, which makes a hell of a lot of difference when you try to get an attitude scale to get both, which only taps one of these, if that many. And the other big thing was that different types of leaders perform better under some conditions and not under other conditions. And specifically, leaders who perform, specifically the degree to which a leader has power, influence, and a low stress situation tends to be task motivated and performs well under these conditions. And a leader who is relationship motivated performs best in moderately powerful situations. And leaders who are task motivated also perform best when things go to hell. When it's difficult, when they have stress, when the task is not very easily understood. And that was a big change from what had been done before. In other words, I said that leadership performance is contingent on the leader's personality and the degree to which the situation provides power and influence.
So you were looking at tasks, relationships, and situation?
Yes. As a matter of fact, if you want to see a graph of this, by pure chance, that happens only 24 hours a day. I happen to have one.
Where is
If
it?
you want to look at it.
Sure, I'm going to hit pause here, and then we'll look at it.
Okay.
All right, so we're still recording. Let's see if I can.
The correlation coefficients and the
Okay, here we go.
baseline.
Okay, now we're back on. So what I'm going to just
Okay.
say for the record is that you handed me a graph, and you can
Well,
tell
the
me what we're
dots
looking at here.
are the based on the correlation coefficients
Mhm.
between LPC, this,
Right.
and performance. And as you can see, the high LPC people perform in the middle,
Right.
and the low ones perform at the end.
Mhm.
And this is a validation, a set of validation studies in industrial outfits.
The figure is called correlations between supervisor, LPC, and team performance, various work situations.
Yes.
Yeah.
And these are chemical, or there was a chemical plant and a heavy machinery plant and meat packing plants in 100 and some supermarkets.
And so these were basically all precursor studies to the 1967 book.
Uh,
Now, this one is
This book.
1966.
no, they
Yeah.
were both in here.
Yeah. Mhm.
But these are quite unusually high.
So, just again, so that we have a baseline, could you, if somebody wanted to read a good example of accepted leadership theory before your book came out, what would they read? Who was on top of the field before you published?
Oh, people like who was being honored today besides myself?
Well, the only one that I know is Russ Mobby, and he's not a leadership
No,
theorist. So.
no, but
Ed Hollander.
Ed Hollander
Okay.
and Ed Fleischman
Mm-hmm.
and
Bob House.
who?
Bob House. Bob House.
Bob House. The whole bunch of people.
And they were all Americans.
Most of them. There were some English students. There were some English investigators. It was a much published field.
You had proven with your dissertation that you were kind of an iconoclastic scholar, willing to break with the past, and could see paths of inquiry that other people didn't see, and that you were willing to follow those paths. At what point did you realize, when you were working on your leadership research, at what point did you realize that you were going to produce results that were different from the mainstream in your field, and that were likely to turn leadership scholar, really likely to turn leadership scholarship upside down? When did you know you were really onto something that was going to be a game changer?
Oh, with a basketball study.
That far back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know it, but I had a good idea that we were onto something. And there were a lot of people who worked with me. Something like 20 different military officers, for instance, who got their PhD. I think something like 15 military officers got their PhDs at my lab.
While you were still at Illinois?
And at Washington. Something like 15 or 20. And Susan
Murphy.
Murphy
Yeah.
said today that there were 20, I had sponsored 20 PhDs. I don't, no, 30 PhDs. I'm not quite sure that that's true. But, It was a lot of people.
I was going to say, I tried to count up when I was doing the background reading, and there were an awful lot. 30 seems close.
Does it?
You know.
I would have thought fewer.
a-
But they did, these people did quite well. One of them, for instance, became a general, and two of them became generals. And lots of them were full colonels in the army after they got through.
I'm going to talk to you more about the military later on, but would you say that your work on leadership had a significant impact on the way the military teaches and practices leadership?
Certainly the military,
Officer Corps.
yeah, this certainly was pointed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the Air Force Academy may, and I have not kept track of it, and and I don't know about the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
I never had any Navy students,
Mm-hmm.
but the military did, for sure.
According to my count, you worked on the research that produced your 1967 book for about 10 years.
Could be.
At
It was
some point-
slow battle.
I didn't say that, for the record. At some point, did you realize what you were onto, and did that slow you down? In other words, did you feel as though you really had to have your ducks in a row before you published?
What do you mean?
Well, at some point, did you realize how much of a game changer your research was going to be? And did that cause you to be more careful in your results, in the work that you did, in the documenting of your results? Because it seems to me that you didn't rush to publish.
No, I didn't. But it was fairly early that I knew that we were doing something different. And I don't know, I've got something like my first post-PhD award was just a few years after I graduated. So I must have been pretty good.
Were you ever worried that somebody else would come up with the same idea?
No. But there have been many people who have written scathing critiques.
I think some people made their careers critiquing your work.
Yeah. And I don't think this has slowed it down.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if I can frame this in a way that works. I understand that from talking to some of your colleagues that one of the strengths of your work was its inductive nature. That is, you didn't start with a theory,
That's
you ended
right.
up with one.
Yes.
But that was also one of the things that opened you up to criticism.
Yes. On the other hand, a lot of the stuff I did was also validated. So I didn't just throw out an idea.
No,
and
that's not what I'm saying.
Well,
I mean, was that the customary way to do research in your field? Or was it more the other way, that where a person
Both.
would postulate a theory and then,
both.
you know, okay.
Somebody like Festinger, for instance, certainly postulated theory, and so did a number of other people. It's nice if you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
But leadership is such a difficult topic, really. It's not easy.
Why do you think that is?
Well,
As the leading scholar of leadership.
because there are so many different variables. A lot of people have stopped by for instance, showing that certain leaders have very pleasant groups, cohesive groups, and others that don't. And there have been studies that leaders have certain attitudes and attributes like intelligence and experience, which turned out to be flaps, and so on. And there have been a lot of studies which have started out with no theory. But in general, a lot of studies have had theory from other fields and tried them out.
For an average person who thinks about or reads about leadership, what they're apt to think of are great leaders, presidents, generals, governors, or I think of James McGregor Burns, who wrote about leadership and focused on high-level leaders. But you seem not to have done that. I mean, you look at steel workers and bomber crews and tank crews, and why did you take that particular approach?
Because it was possible to get good criterion data. If a basketball team is good, you can tell.
Right.
And if a tank crew shoots and finds the target, you know it's good. And if a meat market sells a lot of meat, that's good. Or has a high profit rating. We've always looked for good criteria. And a lot of people in the leadership field have not done that. I think I have perhaps been more meticulous about the criterion problem than the others have. That is, I have really looked for situations in which there are good criteria, good measures of performance.
And do you think that separates your work from the field?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there must be other people who've done that. But I've probably done it earlier and longer and to a greater extent than many of them, than most of them, if not all of them. Certainly other people who've done leadership research with hard criteria, especially people in the Army research field. But they have gotten some results, but they have not been as clean as the ones I've used, and the outcomes have not been as consistent as those I have gotten, and my students have gotten, my associates have gotten. And there are a lot of people who followed.
Do you think the fact that you conducted research in areas where there were hard criteria and measurable outcomes, and where, in a sense, real people had to perform, whether it's on a tank crew or a bomber crew or making steel or whatever, that enhanced the impact of your work?
Oh, I'm sure.
Significance of your work?
I'm sure. The soft criteria, So you're more cuddly than others, or you're more hard-nosed than others, and you make people feel better than something else. But I've always seen the criterion problem as the basis for research. And I've done that in clinical psychology too. And I've been concerned with the criterion, although that it's hard to get good criteria in a field like clinical psychology.
And in fact, I was just looking down at my notes here. All of your former students who I could either track down online or, in the case of Martin Chemers and Harry Triandis, talked to in person, emphasized how careful you were as a researcher, right? And how you saved all your data.
Yes, yes, boxes are full are still someplace else. I don't think we took any with us after I retired.
So did you donate it to a library somewhere?
It's hard to donate IBM cards to a library.
That's true.
No.
Yeah. No, my master's thesis had a data set on IBM cards that I eventually had to throw away, or unusable after a while. But
It's really interesting how fast the field has made previous data useless. I still remember the needles which we stuck into the hollow with.
Well, I started with punch cards, but I want to get you to talk through some of the key research steps along the road to the publication of A Theory of Effective Leadership. And you alluded to some of the studies that you did of informal leaders like high school basketball teams and that won most of their games. When you did that, you developed something, you wrote an article, it was called The Assumed Similarity Measures as Predictors of Team Effectiveness. What contribution did that assumed similarity measure as predictors of team effectiveness have to the subsequent development of your contingency model?
Well, the assumed similarity between opposites is the similarity between yourself and the preferred co-worker.
Right.
And the assumed similarity to the APN, ASN, is the similarity to the opposite to that.
Right.
And between them is something called ASO. And ASO is correlated with the ASN score, and ASN is basically the preferred co-worker score. So it was a natural and a more precise measure of your not preferred co-worker than ASO was.
Of all the things that you could have picked, how did you end up with basketball teams?
Well, we picked a lot of things. This came out. That is, ASO came out of the therapy studies. That is the similarity between the therapist and the patient. And ASO came out of the basketball study. And we just, one of my students pointed out that ASN, the assumed similarity to the least preferred coworker, was a better way of doing it.
So that idea came, or that twist came from a student.
Yeah, well, we were all involved.
So then we talked about the studies that you did with the B-29 crews, and you also did studies with tank crews, and published something called The Influence of Leader-Keyman Relations on Combat Crew Effectiveness.
Yeah.
How did those studies and that piece contribute to the evolution of your 1967 vote?
Well, the problem was that the influence of the aircraft commander, for instance, depended in large part on how well he got along with the navigator, with the navigator and the bombardier.
Mm-hmm.
And if the aircraft commander and the navigator or the bombardier got along well, then the aircraft commander as well as the navigator or the bombardier's score would contribute to the performance of the crew. Or for instance, in a study of farm cooperatives, the general manager had most influence if he was accepted by his subordinates, by his assistant managers. If there was a rift between the two, then there was no, he didn't have any direct channel to the outcome. And this is also true of steel crews, for instance. There was a senior melter and a junior melter, and the junior melter's score depended in part on how well he got along with the senior melter, and vice versa. The senior melter's score depended in part on how well they got along with the junior melters.
As you were working through these various studies, did the institutions that you studied, like the steel or the tank, military or whatever, did they see value in what you were doing? I mean, did they?
No, they wouldn't do it.
I mean, did they learn from? Do you think they learned from participating in your study? Did they improve their effectiveness, their outcomes, their?
I hope so. You never can tell. It's, a change in management would make a difference.
1958-59, you went to the Municipal University of Amsterdam as a Fulbright Fellow?
Yes.
Yeah. And while you were there, you conducted laboratory experiments
Yes.
related to leadership.
Yes.
And if I understand it correctly, you had Catholics and Protestants.
Yes.
And you put them in groups,
Yes.
some homogeneous, some heterogeneous, and you studied them. And you wrote at one point, you said, I began to look at these groups as falling on a continuum of how much power and influence the situation gave to the leader. This really constituted the inception of the contingency model. Could you talk a little bit about how that research contributed to the inception of the contingency model?
I don't think I can.
Okay.
The one thing that's really interesting that came out of these studies was that task-motivated leaders perform best with groups of their own faith, and relationship-motivated leaders relationship-motivated leaders perform best with groups of their own faith, but task-motivated leaders perform best with groups of the opposite faith. And that was also true of the Belgian Navy study, where we had 480 recruits and 218 petty officers. That was a huge study, and the Belgian Navy was very interested in it. And we got the same results, which is sort of a hallmark of my research, that we validate. We repeat studies. We look at other things which are like them and see if they work. And we've been both lucky and persuasive getting people to do that.
To getting them to cooperate with your research.
Yeah.
Let's
It's
see.
particularly important in Belgium, which has Flemish, which has two almost equal Flemish and Walloon regions, one of which speaks Dutch and the other one speaks French, both of them with accents.
And so when you did the Belgian naval study, you really were also looking at those factors as well.
Well, that's what we're doing.
Okay, all right, okay.
We were
Okay.
quite
Okay.
concerned with that. And this was a very important thing for the Belgians, because otherwise they wouldn't have given us this much cooperation. I mean, that's almost unheard of.
And in fact, the Belgians are still struggling with that.
And have been
Issue.
since 1800 and what? 13?
43.
43. And the Dutch Catholics and Dutch
Right.
Calvinists
Right.
have been at it since
1540.
15.
At least. I believe 1540 though. Let's see where we are here. I wanted to talk to you first about the paper you published with Leonard Berkowitz, and then about your book. But
I'm not Berkowitz.
he was a colleague at Randolph Field, editor
yeah.
of Recent Advances
Yeah.
in Experimental Social Psychology, and you wrote a chapter for him
Yeah.
that really sort of trotted out your contingency theory. But I'm thinking that we've been talking for about 2 hours, and maybe this would be a good place to break, and we'll just start with that the next time and talk about your book and so on, if that's agreeable to you.
Yes. If you're getting tired, it's okay.
Well, I really hesitate to go longer than 2 hours,
Okay.
and it's
Okay.
5 o'clock. So, before I turn it off, though, I'm going to thank you very much for being kind enough to sit here with me for 2 hours.
Well, it's always fun to talk about myself.
Well, that's the beauty of oral history, though. You give people a chance to talk. All right, so we're on. Today is October 29th, and I am interviewing Dr. Fred Fiedler, currently Professor Emeritus of Psychology, University of Washington, at the annual meeting of the International Leadership Association in Boston, Massachusetts. I would like to ask your permission to record this interview, to have the interview transcribed, and to deposit the interview and the transcription in the IUPUI archives for the use of its patrons.
You have it.
Thank you very much. So, I'll say for the record something we chatted and laughed about while the recorder was off. You mentioned that you met your wife on a very special day, and none of us could come up with the term. It's Sadie Hawkins Day, when girls could ask the boys for dates. So, I asked you a question yesterday, and I think I didn't frame it very well. So I'm going to try it again and see how we did. I asked you if you could talk about the scholarship of leadership that existed before your 1967 book came out. And in other words, what was it that you overturned?
Well, there were a number of things. One was that leadership was sort of historical. The histories of presidents and management officials, great men, the great men. And I did not overturn that. That's always been interesting and continues to be interesting. The other part of leadership, the selection and prediction of leadership performance, consisted of looking for a trait of leadership, or an attitude, or a personality interview that dealt with the individual's past. And what everybody was looking for was the trait the leadership attribute, whether trait or personality or an attitude, but it was the one leadership trait. And what I found, and by the way, others have sort of hinted about that too, and it wasn't a brand new idea, that there were leaders who were concerned with the task, and leaders who were concerned with the group and the personal relationship. This was sort of vague, and very often people sort of danced around that. And I was able to show, I and my students and my associates were able to show that we were really talking about two different types of leaders. Leaders who were, in fact, task-oriented, task-motivated, to whom the task was the important part of any of a group enterprise. And there was another type of leader whose concern was with the group, with the relationship. And these were two different types of persons. And we were able to measure that with the scale, which in fact was called the least preferred co-worker scale. That is, a leader who, a task-motivated leader who was willing to kick out somebody who didn't work on the task, or who was and they were in fact willing to be punitive to people who didn't do the job, versus people who were also interested in the task, but they were not willing to do that, who were concerned with maintaining the group, meaning cohesiveness. They were a much softer, had a much more soft attitude toward people who did not perform well. And this was a major difference. And the fact that we put that into a simple scale, 8-point scale, eight attitude scale, eight descriptions of personality, scales was really unusual. There had been, and showing that this was related to leadership performance had not been done before. The attitude scales, which had dealt with task and relationship motivated leaders, had been hinted at, and I'm not sure that they hadn't said so in so many words, but it certainly wasn't important. It certainly they certainly did not differentiate them. The main concern was with an attitude scale, with identifying a personality who was a leader.
Before you published, 1967, who were some of the leading scholars in the field of leadership studies before your book came out?
Oh, there were a number of them. Very well-known one. Bennis. And
Okay.
I block on some names.
That's all right.
One of them was who was who just got
No,
some
those are people after 67.
yeah Ed Hollander, Ed Fleischman, Gardner, and so on. There were a whole bunch of very well-known and prominent people who were concerned with leadership, as well as historians and personality psychologists, and of course business psychologists, business people. And I'm sorry, the names escape me, but they were certainly there. And they were prominent and they did good work, but of a different type.
Right.
They were descriptive studies of leadership, and there were attempts to trace the personality of leaders. And in fact, personality psychologists also played a part. It was a concern of interest, and this concern dates back well beyond the Greek, the Greeks who talked about it.
Absolutely. I'm old enough to remember, and I'm 62 for the record, a time when we didn't have computers. And when you were doing this research that led up to the publication of your 1967 book, can I assume that you were not doing your statistics on a computer? Did you have a mainframe you were working on that early, or were you?
Well, there was always the ILA. I started rather early on the computer. I'm not a computer scientist, but I had very bright graduate students who ran circles around it.
That's why God made graduate students. I mean, did you early on do the statistics with a calculator or on a chalkboard, or?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I started to work on the computer. I started to work on leadership right after I got my PhD and moved to the University of Illinois, and we had computers there, and we certainly used them.
And you were entering the data on punch cards at that point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Boxes and boxes.
I mean, what I'm trying to figure out is, as the computers got better and easier to use, did that make your research go easier? Allow you to do more?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Do you think you could have developed your theory without access to a computer?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think so. Although it was easier with a computer.
I'm going to ask a question that betrays the fact that I'm not a social scientist, but most of the people who listen to this recording or read the transcript probably will not be. When I read your work, or I read about your work, and you talk about the least preferred coworker, it almost seems to me to be counterintuitive. I mean, how did you figure out that the way to understand leadership was by looking at the relationship with the least preferred? as rather than the most preferred, or something like that.
There was a lot of trial and error. As I mentioned, the scale originated in its primitive form in psychotherapy, and I expected that the good leader would be somebody who would be close to the members of the group, in this case basketball teams. And I tried everything else. It was natural to ask to have the scale, as I said, became the assumed similarity between opposite scales. Well, one anchor of the opposites was feeling good about the people, and the other opposite was feeling bad about the people. And but feeling good about people on a scale like this doesn't go very far. I mean, you feel good, you put them all down as on the positive scale.
Right.
We also got it on the negative scale, and it was the negative scale which really struck the chord. That there we got the variance, the variation between high and low. And I might point out that the high is just, even in the high LPC people, is just about the middle, if that high. But there you got the variation.
When those results began to emerge from your research, were you surprised?
I am.
Yeah.
And delighted.
And delighted. Okay.
As a matter of fact, most of my associates at that time didn't believe it anyway. It was only when it came out again that people realized that my assistants and associates really became really excited about it.
So when you said your associates didn't believe it, you meant your graduate students, the people in your lab.
Didn't believe it, no. And I didn't believe it either.
So you ran it again,
Yes,
came up with similar results.
yes.
And is that when you also then tested the fraternity brothers?
No, that was earlier.
Earlier, okay.
That was a test of asking people to describe their friends, their best friend, and the person they didn't like. So it was, I was always interested in the two opposites, which was a natural thing to do.
I started to ask you this question yesterday and then realized we didn't have enough time and stopped. But you had a colleague named Leonard Berkowitz.
Yes.
I believe that you had worked with him at Randolph Air Force Base.
Randolph Air Force Base.
And Leonard Berkowitz became the editor of Recent Advances in Experimental Psychology, which was a series.
Yes.
And he invited you to write a chapter for the first volume in that series. And so far as I can tell, that's the first time you published something on a contingency model?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
It's possible.
Well, do you remember how that chapter, when it appeared, was?
I can't even remember the book.
Okay. Well, let's try this then. 1963, 1964, you were overseas again, University of Louvain in Belgium?
Louvain.
Louvain, Louvain for the transcriber.
Yes.
And
V-I-N.
V-A-I-N?
V-A-I-N,
Yeah.
yes. Or Leuven
Leuven.
in Flemish.
Okay. You conducted a study that involved personnel from the Belgian Navy.
Oh, that was later.
Okay, you did not do that when
That was the start. That was in Louvain.
Oh, okay.
The
And-
first study was in Holland.
Right, right. When you were in Louvain doing the study on the Belgian Navy, you were getting close to publication. How did that study influence the development of your contingency model?
Not much.
Okay.
Our contingency model was a dumb thing.
Mhm.
The important thing about the Dutch study and the Belgian study was that I found, my associates and I found, that task-motivated leaders performed best with groups which were different from them, while relationship-motivated leaders performed best with groups which were similar to them in an important dimension. In one case, religion, and in the other case, the region from which the leaders came. Now that was a very important problem. In Holland, perhaps less so, because after all, they'd been together for a long time, and they sort of tolerated each other. But nevertheless, it was quite clear
Mhm.
that this was happening, that the religion did play a part, that religion in Holland is a big thing.
Mhm.
There are Dutch labor unions and Dutch schools and Dutch clubs and Dutch football teams and Dutch whatever.
Football being soccer.
Yes, of both with religion
Right.
In the title.
Right.
In Belgium, however, you had a country which was put together, sort of plastered together by Napoleon. And the differences were in language and culture and attitudes, and to some extent conflicts which didn't come to blows, but were very visible. There were times when we found that street signs were taken down and written in a different language, and with the telephone operators, my wife once called somebody, and the telephone operators insisted that she speak Walloon, the French,
Right.
versus a Dutch.
Did your work in Belgium provide any assistance to the Belgian government as they tried to deal with those problems?
Oh yeah.
Can you talk about that?
It was not the government, but the Navy,
The Navy, I'm sorry. Yeah.
because they have to deal with mixed groups,
Mhm.
Flemish, and that's why the cooperation we got was phenomenal.
Right.
I mean, in the United States, the Army and the Army gave us permission to get data,
Mhm.
and they sort of they sort of were passive about it, but permissive.
Mhm.
In Belgium, they were active. They got subjects for us
Mhm.
in mass. 400 and some petty officers. That's a lot of petty officers.
Sure is.
And something like 400 recruits. Half of them Flemish and half of them
Mhm.
Walloon. that's a phenomenal amount of cooperation. And they had officers design tasks because they didn't like the tasks we had in mind, but they are and reasonably senior officers design tasks, and other officers who evaluated the way the teams performed. There's a phenomenal amount of cooperation.
And they also listened to what you had to say.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. As a matter of fact, the chief, the director of the director of the Ministry of Defense helped us, and helped us design the experiment so that we would get what they wanted too.
So at that point, then, your work with the Belgian Navy really represented a significant practical application of your your work on
But the American Army probably did too. I know that my theory was taught at West Point and other military institutions. Whether it was completely accepted by everybody is doubtful. But
in 1949, the U.S. military integrated. Were you ever called upon to do any studies of black and white military personnel?
But some of the teams we dealt with, no. Actually, I don't recall any time. I think that was too early. Most of us, in most military crews, there are no mixed. I don't think there are mixed by race that I can recall.
Okay.
On the other hand, did some studies with women in a religious organization, a bunch of Unitarians who had a summer camp, and there we had women as well as men in groups and teams. Didn't make much difference.
In 1967, you published a theory of leadership effectiveness, and I looked up as much as I could, reviews and so on. I've seen the book described with terms like landmark, paradigm shift, seminal.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. I could keep going, but I think you get the idea. In evaluating your own work, you said the paper in the Berkowitz volume, which you didn't remember, and the 1967 book created a great deal of interest, and at least according to some, were responsible for a paradigmatic shift in thinking about leadership, which we actually talked about at the beginning. But is there anything that you want to add to that? What the significance of that paradigm shift?
How much more can you say?
I don't know. I'm giving you a chance.
Paradigm shift is about as good as you can get.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, this is the second time that you've now, as a relatively young man, have written something that really shook up your field and represented a paradigm shift. How did this affect your life? I mean, did your life change as a scholar or professional person?
I don't think so.
More students want to study with you, more grant money coming your way, more demands to speak?
I never had much trouble finding money, getting money. Sometimes, as a matter of fact, there was one case where the Surgeon General's office sent me money before I had asked for it. It was, I was a well-known researcher, and we had always done work which was interesting. Yeah, it was pretty good.
So you didn't see much of a change in your professional life after that book came out?
No. Well, I had somebody who described my work yesterday. One of my former graduate students said that I had gotten 40 PhDs. That's a lot of PhDs.
Sure is.
I hadn't realized that there were that many. And there were always some students from abroad, and students from the military, one Coast Guard, one Air Force, and a substantial number of Army people. The Army was always more accepting of this work than the Air Force, although I had an Air Force lieutenant colonel who worked with me and who then taught at the Air Force Academy. They all went to the Air Force, to their service academies afterwards to teach leadership. So it had an impact. Does that answer your question?
It sure does. It absolutely does. So it was very clear when this book came out that you had become a leader, if not the leader, in the field of leadership studies. I wonder how you would.
A number of critics too.
I'm going to ask you about them in a minute, but I wonder how you would assess your own effectiveness as a leader. You clearly were a leader. Did you ever think about that?
I was a very effective leader of a laboratory. And but I really never was I never had leadership jobs of any importance. Outside of that, I once headed a subdivision of the psychology department, and I think I did a good job. But after that, I was never seen as somebody who would be an outstanding leader.
Let me turn that around a little bit. You certainly led the field of leadership studies with your ideas.
Yes.
Right. And did that also make you a leader in the sense that you were a leader, a scholarly leader, a thought leader?
Is a chess master a leader?
So you would then think of yourself as more of a chess master than a leader?
Well, I hadn't thought of chess master before, but I didn't impress people as somebody who would be an outstanding leader. I'm quite sure of that. I was an onlooker.
I'm thinking of all those graduate students that you attracted and trained, who then went off to, careers of their own, clearly influenced by you and your thinking and your scholarship and your method.
Well, I was sure as hell task oriented.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, one of the things they remember is that every once in a while I stuck my head into one of the offices and said, "Work," or "What did you find today?"
That's the one I heard from one of your colleagues, that you stuck your head in the door and asked him, "What did you find today?" So
You did not hear from my colleague?
I did. I don't remember which one. One of the people I called
Yeah.
told me that you had opened his door and said, "What did you find today?"
It wasn't really, I didn't really expect any great results, but it was sort of half funny.
But I would have to look at my notes to see exactly who said that. But what I can say is the person told me that, he said, I didn't necessarily find anything new today. I always believed that Fred did. That's what he told me. So.
Well, that was not a serious remark, but I think it sort of epitomized my concern with the task, certainly.
I read your little piece called "Life in a Pretzel-Shaped Universe," and you wrote in there. You said, "My best-known contribution is the development of the contingency model. It was really then that I had my first eyeball-to-eyeball confrontations with the pretzel shape of life in leadership research." Could you explain what you meant by that? What is the pretzel-shaped life of?
It was much more, above all, the contingency model is a much more complex explanation of leadership. I mean, you had two different types of leaders, and you had a problem of analyzing how the environment of the task would affect which leader would be more effective. It was which had never been described before, as far as I know. And it was putting these two together which really made a much more complex picture of the leadership problem than had been seen before. Before it was, you have the personality or the attitudes or whatever of a leader. And the question is, are you a leader or are you not a leader? No matter almost no matter what the task was. And I analyzed how the task was related to what kind of a leader would be effective. So this was a much more complex and pretzel-shaped picture.
In addition to effusive praise for a theory of leadership effectiveness, your book also attracted a great deal of critique.
Oh, yes.
And your former student and later your colleague, Martin Chemers, told me, he said he felt those critiques came from two sources. One is the toes you stepped on, the entrenched interests, and the other was its inductive approach. But I'm wondering how you would describe and assess the critiques.
Say this again.
His assessment was that people critiqued your work for two reasons. One is that you stepped on scholarly toes, entrenched interests, and the other was its inductive approach. But I'm wondering how you would assess the critiques of your work.
Well, there were a lot of people, There were a number of people who just didn't believe it. They didn't think this was real stuff early on. And the answer to that was validation, and test after test after test. And there's a mountain of, compared to other approaches, so there was a mountain of studies which supported the model. And before that became overwhelming, there were a lot of people who criticized. They didn't understand the least preferred coworker at all, or did not intend to understand. And a lot of people, of the critics, attacked the least preferred coworker scores as something which was just silly, or which did not. Which they didn't understand. Why? Same question you asked. Why the least preferred coworker? And I myself didn't really understand that. Martin Chalmers did, but he's one of the brightest. The other was a matter of just simple jealousy. And I know this sounds petty, but I'm quite sure that was in part the case. And in part, and interestingly enough, there have been a number of my colleagues who later sort of apologized for that. It was such a different stance in this field that a number of people just couldn't believe it.
Now,
for two reasons. One was that the least preferred coworker score didn't make any sense to them. And I can understand why it didn't make any sense to them. Why the least preferred coworker? Why an 8 item scale should make a difference, or a 10 item scale, whatever it was. And the other was that it seemed so obvious afterwards that it was and so different from the rest of the leadership stuff that was difficult to swallow.
Speaking as somebody who thinks of himself as a humanist and not a social scientist, what surprises me a little bit is it seems to me as though, given what you did, that it would have been possible for people to test that themselves. In other words, to see if they could replicate the study, rather than just trash it.
Of course, there were some studies I showed you.
Right.
A group of validation studies, and it took a while before people. I mean, it takes a while before you ramp up something.
That's true.
Something like this.
You also said one time, you wrote, speaking of your critics, you said, as is usually the case, some criticisms successfully slew non-existent dragons.
Is that what I said?
You did say that, yes.
Clever phrase. Clever phrase.
I thought it was a very, very nice turn of phrase. What did you mean by the non-existent dragons?
Well, they questioned the validity of the scale. They will question the validity of classifying. You see, one problem with the classification of task-motivated and relationship-motivated leaders that had not been seen by most people. And if it had, I didn't know about it. That is, if you ask somebody, what kind of a leader are you? The task-motivated people said, well, I'm a warm, considerate, cuddly type. But at least with the co-workers, scale up was in the opposite direction. And the warm, cuddly was too the relationship motivated leaders thought of themselves as task motivated. And that's one of the people, as a matter of fact, who did a study of this was Chalmers. And it's very clear that the task motivated people thought of themselves as relationship motivated. The relationship motivated people thought of themselves as task motivated. And almost the same words. And that's what that means is that a lot of the tests of leadership apparently weren't valid.
So self-perception, self-reporting was not working.
Was not working. And you can see why, because task-motivated people saw themselves in a way which was much more flattering. And relationship-motivated leaders also saw themselves in a way which was more flattering. Now, in both cases, to some extent, task-motivated leaders have to be concerned with a group. And to some extent, relationship-motivated leaders have to be concerned with a task. So it's easy to see, and so it's easy to see that they emphasize that part of their leadership behavior, which they didn't, which they were least strong on.
Do you think that the amount of controversy that your work engendered when it first appeared is in some ways a measure of its impact?
Oh yeah, sure. Look at the controversy that psychoanalysis created. Think of there are lots of new ideas which create a lot of controversy, and in some cases justified, in some cases not justified, or partly justified. But you don't attack something that's obvious. You don't get that published either.
Although I think I said yesterday, I think some people may have earned tenure criticizing your work.
Yeah, that too. I can name some of them.
In 1969, you moved to the University of Washington as a professor of psychology and adjunct professor of management and organization, and spent the rest of your career there at the University of Washington. Why did you decide to move from Illinois to Washington?
Have you been to Urbana, Illinois?
Yes.
The saying there was that there's nothing there to keep you from your work.
I shouldn't laugh.
There were soybeans and there was corn. Lots of corn. As a matter of fact, the oldest cornfield in the United States is in Urbana.
Is that true?
Yeah, let's just swear
Yep.
to corn.
It's,
Okay.
and it is considered to be a monument, that cornfield. It's not very big, but it's there. That was one, and it was really it was really a place which was intellectually exciting, It's a very good school. But beyond that, there isn't much there. There are a couple of good restaurants there, and every once in a while a troupe of actors came through to put on a play, and I'm sure the same thing is true of Purdue. And then I sort of felt that I'd exhausted the place. And it wasn't that I didn't have good colleagues. It was very stimulating. And every once in a while I feel that I made a big mistake for moving. Although, as it turns out, Washington has a lot of things that Urbana didn't have.
Well,
in Seattle.
I've also lived near Seattle, and there is a difference, yes.
Yes.
And I noticed that your current address is Mercer Island, which is a very interesting place as well. So,
Yes.
So, I mean, had you gotten quite a few offers after that book came out? I mean, were you? So, you went to University of Washington, where you set up an organizational research group. How was that similar to or different from the group effectiveness laboratory?
Not much.
Not much.
I had more military students there, and I was, of course, better known. Some of the students are very good, and some of them weren't so good. But I came there because the offer was tempting. As a matter of fact, it was once when I turned it down, and I was a little sweetened for next year. I accepted it.
When you were at the University of Washington, West Point was sending you military officers for graduate training.
Yes. But they had sent that at Illinois too.
So what was your relationship with West Point? Was there anything besides training their students? Did you go there and lecture or work specifically with them to develop curricula or anything like that?
It was sort of like I don't remember giving any lectures. I may have talked, but I did talk to I consulted with the superintendent and some of his officers. It was and I became friends with the medical officer in charge there, who was interested in leadership. I don't really know how to characterize my relationship to them. It was certainly very friendly. And in fact, I was accepted by the brass of West Point, as I was, for instance, by the brass of Royal Roads, the Canadian military college in Vancouver, or off Victoria. And on a number of occasions, I gave talks in general to the military, and I remember once being kidded that there were all these. I was at the speaker's table with all the generals that I had been discharged as a technician for free. This happened recently too, when I was in charge of picking of well, it wasn't really picking. It was in charge of the committee to select a the state's adjutant general, the major general, and I was and with me on the committee were two generals and a vice admiral, or an admiral, all of them retired and with lots of stars. So it was sort of a comic relationship in many respects, but I certainly had the respect.
Do you think that your ideas had an impact on the way West Point taught leadership?
Oh, yes. From all I hear, yes.
And given that West Point is at least one of the foremost training academies for military officers in the world,
Oh, yes.
that's a further assessment of the impact of your work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know to what extent it changed with the change of superintendents. You never can tell. But from what I gather, it not only there, but other military establishments also knew about the contingency model and were influenced by it. And this goes of the Navy, and this it goes of the military in Belgium and in Holland and lots of other places too.
I tried to figure out what happened to some of the military officers that you trained, and I was able to find that some of them taught at West Point, some of them National Defense University, some of the Command and General Staff College, the Coast Guard Academy, the Air Force Academy, and some
Commands
of
them. The Air Force Academy or the Coast Guard?
That's what I found. So,
really? I didn't know that.
I mean, it seems to me as though you had quite a multiplier effect, where you trained those officers and then they went off to places where they further trained leaders.
And in other countries too, in Australia, for instance.
So foreign military officers came to study with you.
Oh, yeah.
You know.
No, foreign officers. Yeah, certainly Canadian. I don't know, I can't recall all of them, but the Canadian, but the military academies abroad certainly knew about me.
Let me see if I can make a segue here. Your 1967 book was literally a paradigm shift in terms of the scholarship of leadership. You attracted significant numbers of graduate students that you trained. Your work not only engendered positive response, but criticism in your field. And then there are a number of instances of the practical application of your work in the military and in the civilian sector. And then in 1976, you furthered the practical application of your leadership theory by co-authoring a book called Improving Leadership Effectiveness, the Leadership Match Concept, with yourself and Martin Chemers and Linda Maher, M-A-H-R, which, as I understand it, was really like a workbook that was supposed to really be a hands-on practical application of your work. How did that come about? Where did you? Who came up with that idea to package it up that way? And
I don't know. It was a natural. By the way, were you aware of that the theory of leadership effectiveness was translated into 6 different languages? I was kind of impressed by it myself.
So let me ask you a question about that. If somebody translates your work into a language, I mean, how do you know that they did a good job?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I don't speak Chinese,
Well,
Thai, or Japanese for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I had a Japanese student, though, and you were asking about students. I had foreign visitors, or who came for a year, and there was an Australian, an Israeli, 2 Israelis, a Frenchman, a Dutch student who got his PhD, and I sat in on his PhD dissertation in Holland, on his examination. And who else was in
An
English?
Egyptian.
Who?
An Egyptian.
An Egyptian, right? An Egyptian lieutenant colonel who worked with an Israeli student.
Oh.
And a Thai student.
Oh, a Thai,
And
yeah,
Belgian and
a Belgian. So there were a lot of people.
And but that's also sort of an international effect of your work in
Yeah,
terms of through
yeah.
your students. What was the nature of your collaboration with Chalmers and Marr on that book?
Well, Maha was my secretary for many years. And she became more than a secretary. We urged her to get a PhD, but she was interested in becoming a comedian, which I think is appropriate. But she was not a major
Okay.
contributor to but in a minor way she helped us get that book out.
Mm-hmm.
And, sufficiently so that we felt that she should be a co-author. Chalmers was a undergraduate student who stayed to become a graduate student, as was the case with the woman who introduced me yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
Susan Murphy.
Right.
Uh,
That was at your breakfast.
yes.
Yeah.
Did you hear it?
No, I was up here getting ready. I had an interview that was too tight to.
Well, I think your career will not suffer. And so, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, how did that leadership match represent a practical application of your contingency theory? What was it that you had people doing?
I don't understand the question.
This was like a workbook, right?
Oh, that.
Yeah. What was it that you were having them do? What was the nature of that workbook? What were the tasks that you were assigning them to do? It was like self-study, right? Where they could go through and.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess some people bought the book.
More than 45,000 by by
Really?
the early 1990s, according to my Google search.
I didn't realize that. How many books were sold of an effect?
I just ran a quick
1967.
67. I don't know. I didn't look that up, but because this one was intended for for a broader audience.
No.
I ran a quick search, and according to what I found, you'd sold over 45,000 copies by the early
That's
1990s.
a lot of copies.
It sure is.
That was also, I think that was the book which was republished in 6 languages. No, the leadership effectiveness book was
Yeah.
in 6 languages, but there were also manuals. These sort of manuals were also republished in a number of languages.
And then you updated it into a second edition in 1984.
Did I?
Or at least your name is on it.
Probably did.
Oops, I lost my place here.
I was never a great money maker.
I was thinking less of the money than the impact of your work by making it widely available like
Yeah.
that.
Well, it had impact. It certainly had impact on a lot of universities and which taught leadership courses.
Right. You wrote at one point, and I'm going to read a couple of lines of what you said about yourself as a researcher. You said, "I'm convinced that data are adversaries that have to be beaten into submission. I've been struck time and again by the realization that I really did not begin to understand some of our research results until many years and studies later. Research to me is more like an archaeological dig than a mathematical game. It takes a lot of shoveling and sifting, at least in the area of leadership, before you really begin to hit pay dirt." I wonder what you meant when you said that research is more like a dig than a mathematical game. I mean, I think of social science as all based on math, so...
You think that
I mean, I think of the kind of research that a social scientist does as being math-based.
wow,
And
there's a lot of psychological research which comes out of a hypothesis, and observations, and which is then transformed into a model, and the model is very clean. Good example is Festinger and others who sort of Simon is another one. Newman, somebody at Newman.
Lippmann Blumen.
Who?
Are you asking about Lippmann Blumen or Bloomer?
Couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry, are you referring to Lippmann Blumen or Bloomer?
Newmark, too. No, Newmark was
No, Bloomer. Never.
Herbert Blumer, was a sociologist.
Yeah.
yeah.
Is that who you were referring to?
Well, in some cases, for instance, the game theorists really have a model which they then worked on.
Right.
Well, the field of, in many cases, the field of leadership and other social sciences, sociology, some economics, and anthropology is a matter of playing with the data and examining data and thinking about data and sleeping with them and beating them until they give you some results. And it isn't as neat as the textbooks tell you that you suddenly come up with a clean theory and lo and behold, there it is.
it took you almost 10 years to
Yeah.
put that theory together.
To neaten it up, make it plausible to myself and to others.
Martin Chemmers, as I understand it, one of his specialties is cultural studies?
No, Triandus.
Triandus, okay. To what degree did your contingency model hold up across cultures? Did you ever test that? I mean, would it work in Japan or China or Korea?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
A couple more questions here. In Seattle, when you were living in Seattle, you became a consultant to the county executive, which I assume is King County.
Yes.
For about a decade, you worked in his office. You worked in city government. What were you doing with the county executive? What was one of the world's leading scholars of leadership doing in the county executive's office?
Well, it started earlier. When he became county executive in 1970, I think it was, I was sort of looking. I had just moved from Illinois, and another colleague of mine named Hunt, very bright guy, and I were talking and sort of thought it would be interesting to see whether our Hunt's work is not in leadership, it's something else. It would be interesting to see if we could be of some use to the, in a political sense. And I offered my services, and one of the chief executive, the county executives, close associates said, well, I told the county executive's office I'd be interested in consulting, and so what kind of a guy would do this? And this man said, "Oh, it would be interesting to see what he can do." And so I volunteered, and it was a very interesting experience to volunteer, because there were a lot of departments which needed some help. For instance, I developed a performance form for the fire department, and I worked with the Parks and with the Parks Department, Parks and Recreation, and this and that. We eventually made a film, which Linda Maha, as a matter of fact, directed, to make bus drivers more charming.
Were you in this film?
No.
No.
I was involved.
Here, let me
Sure.
see what's going on here. He is not working.
And
All right, all right, okay, so you mentioned that the part of the fruits of your work was this film for bus drivers.
Yeah. And it was a very interesting experience, because I actually had my hands on, I was free, I had free access to all kinds of things. I saw all kinds of things. I saw what they were doing in the jail, and I was I was taking on rides in the police car, and I had a good time. And I saw how different the public works, for instance, the public works and the parks and recreation department had, the chiefs of those had problems which I helped resolve, and it was a general leadership practicum, and when the county executive won the election for governor, I was one of the people who were on the transition team, which was also a very interesting experience.
What was his name?
Spellman, John Spellman. It was a very interesting experience. I helped pick a judge for one of the outlying counties, outlying districts. And it was a hands-on experience, which was very interesting.
Did you ever take any of that experience and then plow it back into your research? Did you ever publish anything based on that experience?
No, I didn't publish anything.
Yeah.
I published one paper on the weather and the type of robberies which were.
Fred, what about the SeaTac study?
Oh yeah.
Seattle-Tacoma Airport, SeaTac, yeah.
Yeah, the study was named Port Noise Complaints.
Uh-oh.
The complaints about the noise at SeaTac.
Yeah.
Which won a title.
Mm-hmm.
Which won a reward. Judy and I published that together.
Mm-hmm.
So I got my hands into a lot of stuff, which ordinarily academics would not do.
Right. In 1978, James McGregor Burns was a political scientist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author.
Oh yeah.
Taught at Williams College. He published a book titled Leadership, which became an important study on the subject of leadership, quite a different approach than yours. I'm wondering do you know him?
I met him.
Yeah.
Not.
Mm-hmm.
We were not close.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we ever really had a serious talk about it.
Cognitive resource theory. In 1987, you and Joseph Garcia
Yeah.
published a book called New Approaches to Effective Leadership, Cognitive Resources and Organizational Performance.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you wrote about your own work that I found was that was an attempt to explain the contingency model. Was that in some ways a response to people who've been criticizing you all these years?
Can't remember.
Okay.
I also did work, and so did some of my graduate students, on intelligence and experience, the two major predictors of leadership for many years. And we found the results were underwhelming. The correlations were close to zero. among the experience, as a matter of fact, the experience was negatively correlated with intelligence, so that highly intelligent leaders were were negatively affected by experience, and highly experienced leaders were negatively affected by intelligence, by their intelligence. And as leaders gained in experience, the less they relied on the intelligence. And of course, intelligence doesn't change much. But for instance, a study of principles, high school principles, and elementary school principles were quite different in terms of how experience affected the way in which they performed. And there are a number of studies like this also at the post office. So we were interested in a lot of other cognitive resources, and why that particular, also post office managers, why intelligence should have such a negative effect on experience.
What kind of an impact did your findings have on leadership training? Because, again, that's the thing that seems kind of counterintuitive when you first hear it.
Yeah, but it is nevertheless striking. Was there anything in the stuff you read about this?
Yes.
It's a very striking. It's a very striking finding, and it hasn't been much publicized. But But for instance, in high school principals or school principals in general, or and I think post managers too. When they started out, elementary school principals, for instance, when they started out, experience didn't have much effect, and intelligence was important. But as they moved into in their later with their later experience became more important, and leadership became less important.
Intelligence became less important.
Yeah, intelligence became less important, and vice versa with high school principals. And this is kind of striking because when you, generally speaking, managers look for intelligent and experienced leaders.
So how do you think your findings would affect leadership on the ground? I mean,
meaning what?
Well, as you pointed out, when people are looking for someone, they tend to look for intelligence and experience, and your research indicated that those were not as important as people at least intuitively believed. So once you know that, once you had those findings, where do you go from there in terms of understanding leadership and its application?
I don't think this was picked up by a lot of people. I think that was sort of an interesting scene as sort of a ho-hum result. Because I don't believe that most managers believe in that. Believe that that's true.
No, I don't.
It's so
think they do.
counterintuitive.
Right.
But so is after all the contingency model counterintuitive. of the idea that that there are two types of leaders, and that their performance depends on whether or not they match up with the task environment.
As you think back over your entire career in the university, and particularly your work on leadership, how would you assess the impact of your own work?
It's had some impact, but it is certainly not in the folklore. I think I would not expect the man on the street or the woman on the street to know about it or to be affected by it. It certainly has affected some segments of society. I think its effect on, and even the effect on military policy has probably been moderate. But I'm not sure. I don't know.
I want to ask you one more question. Is there anything that I should have asked you and I didn't? Or anything that you wanted to say that I didn't give you a chance to say?
Well, I would be interested in knowing what you're doing with this material.
I tell you what, I'll give you the quick answer and then I'll turn it off and give you the more complete answer. But this is for the Tobias Center for Leadership Excellence at Indiana University and for the International Leadership Association. The recordings and the transcriptions will go into the archive where they will join interviews that we've done with several dozen other leaders to try to create material that will allow people to study leadership and the subject areas embraced by those individuals. So, for example, I interviewed Father Hesburgh up at Notre Dame and James McGregor Burns. I interviewed Lee Hamilton, who was the head of the 9/11 Commission, and we're trying to get a variety of leaders and to do in-depth interviews with them to create an archive of material to help people understand leadership. So on behalf of myself and the Tobias Center and the International Leadership Association, I thank you very much for being patient enough to sit with me twice.